So good morning to everybody who is on the US side of the world, and good afternoon, good evening who's on the other side of the world. I'm speaking to you all from India, so it's good evening for me. Today we're going to have the 21st of our global online seminars in biodiversity informatics. This is also the second in our series of 3 seminars on the history of biodiversity informatics. So last month we heard Arthur Chapman. That seminar is available online on YouTube. This month we have Jorge Soberon, and next month, always the last Thursday of the month, next month we have John Wieczorek speaking about kind of the final phase of the history of biodiversity informatics. So this month we have Jorge Soberon, and I'm not going to give him a full introduction because we only have an hour. Instead, what I'm going to do is just state briefly that Jorge led Mexico's National Biodiversity Commission for a decade and a half. And was instrumental in placing Mexico amongst the world leaders in this field. And therefrom comes the content that he will be talking to you about today. And for the last 10 years, Jorge has been a professor at the University of Kansas. So I've been privileged to have him as a close colleague. So I'm just going to turn the hangout, the seminar over to Jorge. And I thank all of you for tuning in. And remember, please, to send questions for Jorge to me at any one of the various email addresses that you have, town@ku.edu, or to the Google page that you're watching this on. But send questions during the seminar so that we have them after the seminar for Jorge to answer. Okay, Jorge, all yours, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this seminar.
Hello. I'm not sure if this is working already. Town, can you confirm that this is working?
I can hear you and I can see your face. I don't see your screen share yet.
Fine. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I think it's been very successful up to now, and thank you, Town, for organizing it and for keeping it running and for the invitation. Today, what I am going to do is to try to follow a little bit on what Arthur Chapman said last time, and I'm going to concentrate on some of the issues related to the large-scale sharing of data about biodiversity. And I'm going to begin by what I'm going to do is essentially go first doing an extremely brief review of what's the past, and then what were the problems that we had to solve mostly during the 1900s and 1999, the decade of 1990, and then speculate a little bit about what the future would be. I would like to remind everybody that biodiversity data has been around for a long time. This is a 400 years old page of a book in Mexican with the medicinal plants of Mexico known at that time. And every single nation in the world had their own knowledge about the life around them. And some of those knowledge systems were extremely complicated and well organized. I don't need to remind the Indian viewers about the Ayurvedic system, and there were many others. But then, in the 18th century, Linnaeus invented a system called, well, he published the Systema Naturae. This is a system that was capable of organizing all the knowledge in the world under a single system. This graph that I am showing right now depicts the knowledge in Mexico in years, well, in the 16th century, 17th century. This is basically indigenous knowledge, and it's in the order of a few thousands. Then came Linneo, and the amount of knowledge started growing in basically in an exponential way. See that this scale is logarithmic. So the amount of knowledge that was being produced and accumulated became absolutely staggering, and it was mostly done at that time using printed pages. The need to computerize the data was really very strong, and they were pioneers. I'm showing a photograph here of Arturo Gómez Pompa, Mexican scientist. In 1973, he was already reporting on how to computerize the holdings of the herbarium in Jalapa in Veracruz in Mexico. And that was done before the day of relational databases, before the day of the internet, when computers had tape memory and things like that. But it was already happening because the need was very strong. What were the questions and the problems? Why were they computerizing? I think basically it was because they wanted to manage in an efficient way large collections. There were some attempts to analyze scientific questions. Well, numerical taxonomy was one of them. Another one was climate profiling. Gómez Pompa and Nevling in 1970 published a paper describing how to do climatic profiling of plants, the plants of Veracruz, using the methods they had, the computerization. I think that maybe to a certain degree, it was very much a thing of, well, let's do it because we can, without very deep scientific questions, and maybe just because it seemed to be convenient to do it. The thing is that museums started using information technology. And please notice that the data they were computerizing was very simple in nature, in some sense simple. It was data of records of occurrences. By the 80s, there were several pretty successful experiences. There was BRAMS, which was developed in Oxford in the 80s. Muse in Cornell, which as far as I am aware is not anymore working. Pandora, probably it's still working. SMASH at Berkeley, I'm not sure. Tropicus at Missouri Botanical Garden, definitely still working and definitely still very active. And the users of these databases were mostly the museums and the herbaria themselves. This was a thing very much concentrated in the very community that was producing the data. However, in the 19s, governments became interested in biodiversity. Why was that? Well, because that was the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity was a multilateral agreement which was focused on the conservation and sustainable use of the biological diversity of the world. And to do that, governments, well, they subscribed the CBD, they became parties to the CBD, and therefore they had to do things about it. The pioneers and the early developers by far were the Australians. They have been working on this for a while, and they had an agency called ERIN, Environmental Resource Information Network. Arthur Chapman mentioned it last conference. The National Institute of Biodiversity in Costa Rica started very early, and they were doing very interesting stuff by that time, by the beginnings of the 1990s. Then Bogor Herbarium in Indonesia, and there were other agencies. Conavio in Mexico, I'm going to present many examples of Conavio because since I worked there for a long time, I know what they were doing. Was created in 1992 to compile and maintain updated an inventory of Mexican biodiversity. We didn't know how to do it. It was really a big task, and this is something that a group of science advisors to the Mexican government wrote, but there was not a very good idea of how to do it. This part of maintain updated seemed to be really difficult. And of course, compiling an inventory for a megadiversity country, of course, also seemed to be awfully difficult. And besides, the only real data we had in large amounts was museum records. Of course, there were field stations and ecological places where ecologists had been working for a long time, and those spots in the territory had a lot of information, but they were truly points in a very large area. The only data which was somehow to a degree comprehensive was the data in the museum records. This is important because I'm going to make a point about how important it is that these are what is called the primary biodiversity data. So at that time, we didn't have much money because the government of Mexico created Conavio, but the first year there was no budget. So we had an entire year just to think. And fortunately, others were also thinking. This is Dan Jansen, that at that time was associated to the Biodiversity Institute of Costa Rica, INBio, and this is Rodrigo Gámez. Rodrigo Gámez was the director of INBio. And the two of them thought that the Australians were doing pretty interesting stuff, and it would be maybe a good idea to go and see what the Australians were doing. So they organized a trip to Australia. At that time, the Australians not only had computerized several major collections, but they also had developed software and protocols for taxonomic description, and they also had developed software for a thing called ecological niche modeling that was used to predict species distribution. This was very impressive, and a lot of this was based on what is called, later was called, primary biodiversity data. Primary biodiversity data is the elementary data about an observation of individual of a species in some place at some time. A lot of what they were doing was based on primary biodiversity data. At that time, they had a little journal called Erinhis, and they had a lot of tools already developed and in operation and being used by the Australian government. So this trip to Erin was extremely illuminating. Dan Jansen coordinated it and asked Erin to receive observers from Kenya, from Indonesia, from Costa Rica, and from Mexico. And in Erin, we saw how many things you can do with primary biodiversity data. It could be used, this museum data that in the minds of many people are just dusty cabinets and shelves in museums populated by old-fashioned bearded scientists that don't care anything about what happens besides outside their own little taxonomic group. That's the cartoon image. Well, that data was being used by the Australians for a lot of practical purposes, among other things, for modeling distributions. So after we went to Australia, we had a very clear idea. Maybe primary biodiversity data that existed although it was not computerized, and algorithms and electronic layers of climatic data and topographic data and physical data on the planet, maybe this combination could be very powerful. And the question was, could it be done in Mexico? Because it was done in Australia, but Australia is a developed country, and we didn't know if we could be able to do it in Mexico. And moreover, with a couple of exceptions, there were no databases of Mexican specimens. There were the birds, mostly thanks to the work of Town Peterson with his Mexican colleagues, Adolfo Navarro and Ezequiel Benitez. There were also butterflies by Jorge Llorente and some mammal data. We did not have electronic cartography. It took 3 years to develop it. And we didn't know if the Australian algorithms would work in Mexico. But the major problem was that the Mexican data was dispersed on a large quantity of museums and herbaria, and a lot it was in foreign countries. That was the major problem. And this is an example. This is plant specimens, localities with plant data from the University of Texas, from the University of Yucatan, from the University of Arizona, from the Center of Scientific Research in Durango in Mexico, from Institute of Ecology in Jalapa, from the California Academy of Sciences. They worked a lot in Chiapas, but also in Baja California, from CICI, from the National University. And if you pull the data together, then you get something which is much more powerful. But it's a very, very complicated thing to do, because the data comes from all sorts of sources. It's 3.5 million registers from 360 herbaria. Now, today, when we started, it was just one herbaria and just parts of it. So the problem, and this is not just the plants, this is the birds. The birds were worse. Red points are specimens of birds that are in Mexico, and the blue points are specimens that are in foreign museums. In the particular case of birds, 64% of the specimens are in the United States, 13% in Mexico, and 3% in Canada, and 2% in Europe, and some other places that I don't know where they are. So this is a general problem. And we had to tackle, I'm talking about the early 1990, 1993, 1994. There was a reluctance to share the data. That was one problem. And the other problem was that the data was distributed over many institutions on different data formats. Some people use DB3, some people use Excel files, even older things, because I'm talking about more than 20 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. Some people were using the databases in word processors. There were all sorts of weird things. And the two problems are a combination of the social and the technical. Both require a commitment by different actors to share and to digitize, and then to willingness to share, and then the technical issue of how to share. And that requires development of tools. These are quotes from Taxacom, whose discussion group on taxonomic issues of that time. This is a museum curator. I'm not going to name the name. It will be impossible to reference a 200,000 specimens collection. Impossible. It's a quote. I just cut and pasted the quote in the discussions in Taxacom that are available. There's another one. I can think of no institution with complex databases based on different software that have meaningfully exchanged data. Well, at that time, there were no ways. There was not a way of interchanging data if the data was based on different standards, different formats, and different platforms. And this is a Mexican. We are sitting on a pile of money, the museum data, and we will only share it over my dead body. This is a quote. And another, this is a Brazilian, sharing data is just another form of biopiracy. So you can see that there were, at that time, 20 years ago, a lot of resistance, partly because people thought it was impossible, and partly because people thought it was undesirable, both things. Nevertheless, in 1996, the Commission on Environmental Cooperation of the three NAFTA countries, which are Canada, the United States, and Mexico, for pretty interesting reasons, decided that they wanted to try to share environmental data, see if it was possible. And they started, the idea was to begin with the primary biodiversity data of birds. Why that? Well, in good, well, very much because there were people like myself, like Town, like Kristalka, the director of Biodiversity Institute, some Canadians that were very much into primary biodiversity data, advising this Commission on Environmental Cooperation. But for whatever the reason, the Commission gave seed money to the University of Kansas in the United States and to Conabio in Mexico to launch platforms of sharing data through over the internet from different platforms. And the two software platforms were called the Species Analyst in Kansas and the Red Mexicana of Información sobre la Biodiversidad, which is acronym is REMIB in Mexico. REMIB and the Species Analyst. By 1997, the University of Kansas had developed the platform that was called the Species Analyst. It was based on a protocol for library interchange, that interchange of data among libraries. And eventually, the Species Analyst would be linking about 40 million of records in collections mostly in the United States and Canada. This is an example from this source. The species analysis is no longer active, but it was active and working for several years. REMIB was the platform that Conabio in Mexico developed. REMIB, first we had to convince the Mexican museums to share the data. And that was a major labor. We had to work with them to organize meetings, to listen to their needs and their complaints and their misgivings and the mistrust the Mexican typically have for anything that comes from the government and things like that. But eventually, a thing called the Oaxaca Declaration was signed, expressing the willingness of the Mexican herbaria and museums to share data. And the technical fix was a platform mounted on very much on native to the internet, on TCP/IP sockets. REMIB is still operating, and it links 124 collections of 6 countries with about 57 million specimens. The Species Analyst and REMIB showed to the world that it was possible to digitize and to share using the World Wide Web primary biodiversity data held in independent institutions. This was a demonstration of feasibility, a proof of concept. And it stimulated the creation of global protocols because those were Species Analyst and REMIB were very incipient initiatives. We needed much more work to make things more robust. And those things were DGIR, which is a protocol of data interchange, and the Darwin Core, which is a protocol of data organization. Both Species Analyst and REMIB were based on primary biodiversity data and were run by scientists, not by politicians, not by administrators, not by diplomats, by scientists. And they both were based on primary biodiversity data. Well, very early, by 2001, there was the first Didier workshop in Santa Barbara in California, from which the two protocols, Didier and Darwin Core, eventually emerged. And the attendance, it took place in Santa Barbara, California, in the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And a lot of the attendants are still around. Arthur Chapman, John Wieczorek, Raul Jimenez, I don't know about Jim Croft, David Gleis, Walter Berenson, Stan Bloom. A lot of them are still around and working. But these guys and these early workshops are the responsible for the next phase of this work that was now at a global level. But before that, I'm going to briefly describe a failed attempt. Since NABIN, the North American Biodiversity Information Network, was working, and Mexico, Canada, and the US were sharing data using internet, there was an attempt to create the same thing for the entire Western Hemisphere, for all the countries of the Americas, from Canada to Argentina and Chile, leaving aside, for political reasons, Cuba, which was a very bad decision. Yavin wished to become the NABIN of the Western Hemisphere, and it started with some money from GF, $5 million, which sounds a lot, but it is not. It's actually a very, very little money. Unfortunately, despite the resistance of several of the countries, Yavin was directed mostly by consultants, which were appointed by the Organization of American States, which is a political organization, and it stressed secondary data. Yavin, when the $5 million were finished, Yavin basically closed the doors. There are still a few things in the web, but Yavin essentially stopped working, and I think it was basically because they were using secondary data, and besides, the people running it were not the scientists. It was people with other concerns. So back to where we were. Since the NABIN proved through the species analyst and through REMIB that it was possible to digitize large quantities of data. Well, digitizing we knew it was possible because of the Australians' experience, but sharing it via the internet. We were ready at the beginning of the years 2000. We were ready for a larger global organization, which is called GBIF. It's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It was created in 2001 as a mega science initiative, a science initiative from the OECD countries, which are the developed countries of the world. And its purpose was to enable users to navigate and put to use vast quantities of biodiversity information, to advance scientific research and avoid duplication of effort and expenditure. And key names in this initiative were Eben Nielsen, that at that time worked in CSIRO. He is deceased now, and Jim Edwards, that was an American that was at the time involved with the National Science Foundation. This is a look of how GBIF looks today. GBIF now provides access to about more than 500 million occurrences, almost a terabyte of data. And if you see the map, this each data point is each point is a place where at least one occurrence data has been recorded, maybe many more. These are the countries that participate in GBIF. In order to participate in GBIF, a country needs, you can just be an associate participant if you don't pay the dues, or if you pay the yearly dues, you are a voting participant. In the map, the countries in green are voting participants. the countries in orange are associate participants, and the others are non-participants. Notice that there is, well, a lot of Western Europe is a voting participant. There are several African countries, quite a few, that are also voting participants. The participation of Africa has been very noticeable in GBIF. The US and Mexico pay, and also Colombia and Peru and Chile and Uruguay, but Brazil is just an associate participant. And notice that India is also an associate participant. And notice that China and Russia, which have really large data sets, they are not contributors to GBIF. In any case, GBIF is, it has been working for 15 years now, and the amount of data it is sharing has been growing and growing and growing since it started sharing data about 10 years ago. This is the line of number of occurrence records that are being shared by GBIF. Right now, we are in the order of 600 million records. This is the largest repository of occurrence data, primary biodiversity data in the world, and it keeps growing. Now it is growing mostly due to the incorporation of data from citizen scientists, the amateurs, the people that do bird watching or butterfly watching, or the phenology of flowers, when do they start blooming, and things like that. Increasingly, things like iNaturalist and other networks of amateur naturalists. But there are still quite a few records from museums that are not yet in GBIF. This is one of the areas where GBIF has been trying to push governments to invest money to computerize their collections. We have probably less than 20% of the data in museums in GBIF. GBIF is highly visited, to the point that now it's becoming a victim of its own success, because the servers at GBIF are really stressed to be able to serve all the amount of data that is being requested every day. In the months of August to October of 2015, there were almost 50,000 sessions coming just from the United States, 17,000 from India, and so on, 15,000 from Spain, 14,000 from Germany, the United Kingdom, 12,000 from Mexico, 11,000 from Brazil, 8,000 from Colombia. It's a lot of traffic going to the developing countries. And these are the data download requests by country from in just the month of January of 2016, last month. The United States, there were 5,000 requests of data from 1,000 users in 74 countries. Mostly the United States, with Belgium, but then Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and India would be here. This list, the order of the list changes every month. But as you can see, this is a huge amount of usage, and also quite well spread. The United States is a big user, but Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, India, Argentina, China, many developing countries are also using this data a lot. So what for? What it is used for? Primary biodiversity data. Remember, specimens, dusty specimens in forgotten cabinets in 19th century institutions. What it is being used for? Well, in order to understand why and what for it is used, we need to remember two things. Well, one thing, this is the important thing. The important thing is that primary biodiversity data, which is the label here, the labels in the specimens, is a link between two things, geography and meaning. Because with a name, you can go to get images, you can go to get population data, you can go to get genetic data. You can go to get whether it's a medicinal, an organism with medicinal properties, or an important ecosystem, part of of some ecosystem, or whatever. The name gives you the perspective, the point of view, and the georeference gives you the geography. Primary biodiversity data allows analysis of completeness of inventories, which is very important for planning purposes, niche modeling, this species distributions modeling, and many other things. If we see just the papers published in January of this year, last month, there were 5 papers using GBIF data published by Brazil, 5 by France, 3 by Mexico, and so on. And if you see the total in 2015, almost 170 by the US, 60 by the United Kingdom. We can go down, 36 by China, 35 by Mexico, 31 by Brazil. So people are using this for science, for scientific purposes. But there are also other ways of using this kind of data. I'm going to give you just one example from Mexico. This is an invasive species in the New World, Tamarix ramosissima, the salt cedar. It's originary from the Old World, but it was introduced to the United States, where it has been spreading in the arid lands. It's a plant which causes a lot of impacts because it extracts water from the soil in very large quantities. A single large plant can absorb 200 gallons of water a day, and besides, it's not visited by a lot of animals. It creates very poor ecosystems. A salt cedar stand support only 4 species of birds per 100 acres, whereas native vegetation would support more than, well, 150 species of birds. So it really creates very wasteful and poor environment. So it's a big problem. It was introduced to the United States. This is a model with locations from GBIF of the areas of distribution of, well, the areas of potential favorable for Tamarix ramosissima. And this model was extrapolated to Mexico. And this is, well, to the Western Hemisphere. And you see that, well, half of this used to be Mexico back in the day, but not anymore. So this is the data in the United States. And these are the predictions for Mexico. And this is the data of Tamarix in Mexico. So you see that the model is quite predictive. And it's being used by the Mexican government to plan actions against Tamarix before it really spreads into the rest of the country. The data, all this data that was used for the niche modeling came from GBIF in probably less than 30 seconds. In the old days, it would have taken years to get the data by going to every museum in the world. The map was presented to Semarnat, which is the Ministry of the Environment in Mexico, who started a program of eradication. And the results for Tamarix are being refined to higher resolution. Niche modeling based on data from REMIB and from GBIF has become so important to Mexico that CONABIO has an entire unit. CONABIO is an agency of the Mexican government. They have an entire unit dedicated to do species distribution modeling and niche modeling. And they are used to assess environmental impact manifestations or statements, to grant or deny permits for planting genetically modified organisms, to decide on whether to allow or not the introduction of foreign species, and so on. It's very practical. And this is a proof of how practical it is. This is years from 2001 to 2014, and this is the number in a log scale of the access to the databases of CONABIO by region of the world. This is a logarithmic scale. Well, in the 100,000 per month, you see Mexican sites. These are Mexican universities, Mexican NGOs, Mexican government agencies. Then are different South American sites, but this is 10 times less. And Europe and Asia, maybe a little bit more than 10 times less. And then we have 3 orders of magnitude under the Mexican use is the United States and Canada and Australia. So as you can see, it is very clear that this data is basically useful for the country, for Mexico. The Mexican data is used by Mexicans, and 3 orders of magnitude under that is other countries. So this shows that this primary biodiversity data is very useful at the scale of a country and for many different purposes that include policy, of course, but also include research, include education. I would like to conclude by saying that the 1990s were the years of fighting the important battles. The important battles are the social, the trying to capture the imagination of people and their willingness to do something. There was a battle to convince people of the need and feasibility of digitizing primary biodiversity data. This battle is still being fought in many countries. A lot of countries are still pretty sort of scared of sharing data. But those countries that have gone all the way to share the data are basically reaping the benefits already. Not sharing the data, it's a mistake. It's an important mistake. So this was the first battle that it was won in places like Mexico and the United States in the 90s. It was in, I mean, I'm putting this little image from a medieval manuscript of a battle between a rabbit and a knight. Because I'm using the word battle in not entirely in a metaphorical sense. It was pretty nasty, and people like myself or Town Peterson got a lot of aggressions and bad press, and people were calling names to us because we were promoting the idea of sharing data. This was the first battle. The second one was, okay, you digitize your data, now you have to share it. And not only share it, but share it on a massive scale, through the internet. This was, at that time, quite a novelty. I mean, in the early 90s, not everybody knew about the internet. The World Wide Web was just invented. So it was quite a new thing to do. And finally, the other battle was to demonstrate that this primary biodiversity data, this occurrence data from museums and from observations of an amateur, could be useful for real life things, for policy things, for management things, and of course for science. These 3 battles mostly were won in the 1990s. Now, what's in the future? I think the future is about several things. The first one is we want to link other types of data. Primary biodiversity data acts as the hinge, the link between different things. But those things are important. We want to link in a smooth way, in an easy way, with capable software. We want to link phylogenetic data, morphological data, ecological data, other types of data that live in their own databases, in their own worlds, or worse, they have not yet even been computerized. They are still in the literature or in the brains of people. And I see a future where we're going to have the same way that we have now databases for occurrence data like GBIF. We're going to have databases for morphology, databases for ecology, pollinators, parasites, predators and competitors, nitrogen fixation, primary productivity, all sorts of things. And the second thing is the capacity to operate with true big data. Right now, we would like to believe that GBF is big data. GBF is not big data. GBF is largish data. It's not so small data. Big data, it's transported in trucks full of hard drives because it's impossible to move it through the internet. The real big data. So eventually, biodiversity will have that. Mostly because of amateur scientists and also because of automated recorders, things that are going to be capturing data all the time in real time in many parts of the world. And that is going to be convert biodiversity data into real big data. That's going to be another challenge. However, I would like to end with this phrase by a guy called Yogi Berra here in the United States. Predicting is difficult, mainly the future. So we would have to see what happens. Thank you very much. I wonder if there are questions or comments on this talk. Town.
Yeah, thank everybody who is watching. I'm going to put up some email addresses in the hope that you will send questions to Jorge. Please do it soon. I, as you might imagine, have a couple of questions for Jorge. And given that nobody sent anything during the seminar, I'm going to ask them. Jorge, I wonder if there's another lessons here that maybe you could reflect on. You've kind of summarized about 2 decades of progress in this field, and in initiatives, you mentioned one, you mentioned several that stayed, but there are also initiatives that are another set of acronyms and such. I'm wondering if you could just reflect a bit for everybody on what have been the effective GBIC and GBIO and GEO, and I mean, there's just this alphabet soup. What have been the meaningful initiatives, and what have been the, I don't want to say meaningless, but the ephemeral or transitory ones that really didn't advance the field?
Yes, there have been, and there are still a lot of initiatives, some of them with money. I think that well, I mentioned 2 lessons. One is the first one is that when we started doing this, Town, if you remember, we were basically interested in the science of it, how this could be used to answer questions, and this is what drives a scientist. And we had the experience of the Australians, of course, but we had a very strong suspicion that this data would be useful for science questions, and the applications came later. In a sense, well, in fact, for me, it has always been a surprise to see all the different things that people invent to do with this data. Once the primary data is out, applications that you could have not dreamed of start being possible, and people do them because they just think on their own problem and see that the data is there, and they find a way of researching their questions with this data. When you begin the other way around, as many initiatives in the soup of letter that you mentioned, when you begin the other way around, thinking on what is politically popular at a particular point in time, you may end well being extremely short-lived, because because soon somebody's going to discover that their question was badly stated, or it was not important after all, or just the fashion changes. So in the political world, in the policy world, fashions dominate things. Things that were fashionable 5 years ago are not fashionable anymore. But in the science world, you keep working on questions until you have solved the problem. So I think that if the initiative is managed and dominated by administrators or diplomats or professional lobbyists, we have seen in the past that I don't think it's going to work. As I said before, predicting is difficult, mainly the future. So I don't know. Maybe there is going to be a surprise. But I think that most of the, with the exception of GBIF, most of the initiatives on biodiversity these days are dominated and conducted by professional administrators, which have very little understand of the science and the technical issues. They are perfectly capable of going and moving very well in the international arenas and going to meetings and using the right words. Distinguished Madam Chairperson, I am very grateful to be given the word in this, and so on. We scientists tend to be less formal and more down to earth. And I think that that's the main lesson I have. The third lesson that I would like to stress is, the first lesson is primary data, second, scientists. The third one is, don't expect to be surprised. Expect to be surprised by how many new things people invent for this kind of data. That was a very interesting experience for me, to realize that suddenly people were, I mean, we were created to do conservation, and suddenly we were answering questions about the spread of diseases or invasive species or GMOs, things that we never dreamed it could be possible to address. But the data is very fundamental, and fundamental data gives very general answers. So that, I hope that answers your question, down. I don't think that this soup of letters will go very far, as long as most of them are dominated by professionals of meetings, people that their life is attending meetings, rather than being in the lab with students or working at a computer or in the field collecting data.
So still hoping that questions will come in, but I'm going to give you one more meantime. And this is kind of a parallel question, but from the other side. You know, you led the development of Mexico from not zero, but not much, to a world power in biodiversity informatics. Let's imagine I put you in some other country that is where Mexico was in the, in 1988 or something like that. What's the path forward, or what are the set of possible paths forward that you think might be particularly effective?
The connection is not very good, and I hear you with interruptions. Are you asking me, in a different country, what would be the likely scenarios that would produce something well, successful in terms of biodiversity?
I'm asking, if you were to do what you did in the early 1990s, do that now in 2016, what would be your strategy, and what would be just some reflections on what a country-based effort might do 25 years after when Mexico did it?
Yeah, the computerization and sharing is almost kind of taken for granted. Maybe it's not being done because of lack of money, and in some countries because of still they are still thinking in the old-fashioned way that you don't computerize because you don't share the data. It's going to be used by biopirates or by morons that don't know the difference between concept of species, whatever. But that, I think that's basically in the past. I think that the next steps are going to be related to making digitally available knowledge, as you call it, DAK, digitally available knowledge of whole areas of knowledge that are still in the papers or in the books. Things related to ecological relationships, who's a pollinator of what, who is a nitrogen fixating species in what conditions, what pH of the soil, who disperses the seeds of what are the parasites of what, who parasitizes me, things like that. Those databases, we don't have them. We need also databases for dispersal. We need databases that document for thousands and thousands of species, not just a few, for all of them, because the literature is full of information. Digitize all the information about pollen dispersal, seed dispersal, dispersal by little groups of individuals, like for instance in pieces of vegetation floating across the ocean, things like that. All the data that is available about that should be computerized, digitized, and placed in databases that are available to everybody. This is another major initiative down, and people like GB all the time talk about it, but doing it is a very complicated thing. The primary biodiversity data is easy to model. All those efforts by Tadwi and later by that led to Digger and the Darwin Core are oriented to a data entity which has some sort of formal properties which are fixed and easily described, relatively easily described. I mean, there are a lot of complications, but the ecological data is very complicated. I think that requires advances in computer science. So I think that is going to be the future. The future is going to be linking completely different data sets, indigenous knowledge, medicinal information, all those things. And that's in the future. So if I were like leading again a biodiversity agency in a country like Mexico, I would just keep doing what we were doing with specimen data and start investing real money in the other parts. And that requires also the conceptual parts. It's not just a matter of copying things into a computer. You need to have an idea of how it looks, how is the shape of the data, what is the ontology of different types of data, how are you going to link them. It's a matter of computer science, not just of technical databasing. That's what I would do. Fortunately, I am not going to do it again. It was a lot of pain doing the first part.
Okay, well, Jorge, thank you so much for the seminar and for the thinking. So very, very much appreciated. And audience, the third of this series on the history of biodiversity informatics will be given by John Wieczorek, and it should be the last day of March. Also 9 a.m. Kansas time and 3 p.m. London time, and you can figure out your time. But my thanks to everybody for listening in, and a special thanks to Jorge for giving this talk. And we'll see you next month.
Not at all. Thanks to you for the invitation.